Thank you, Mr. Michaels. Thank you for the opportunity to update the board and the community about our unaudited actuals. So as background, school districts create a budget, we update it twice, and then we settle up for the year. So essentially we settle up as of 6:30. We need to do that by 9:15, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. Next slide, please. So while inflation has trended down substantially, it is far above the Federal Reserve target of 2%. The Federal Reserve is watching inflation closely, and if inflation does tick up, they will continue to increase interest rates, which puts the economy at risk. And so inflation continues to have a negative impact, especially on our employees here in Napa Valley Unified. And so just for an example, a data point that we look at are healthcare rates. And so healthcare rates were just announced. Kaiser rates, for example, are going up 11% in January. So our employees are negatively impacted by inflation. Next slide. This is a very interesting and colorful slide from school services. And so what it talks about is just the impact of inflation. So once inflation is within the system, it's very hard for it to go away. When inflation goes up, employees demand more money. You increase their wages, then they have more money to spend on goods and services. What does that do? That creates more inflationary pressure. People go on vacations, they spend money on cars, they do things like that. And what does that do? That causes more pressure to increase wages. And so while inflation is starting to go in the right direction, there's still a lot of pressure. It might be some time before inflation goes back down to 2%, which is our historic average. Some of the things that we're also seeing, we're seeing impacts on the housing market, like something we would never expect. Everyone said that the housing market was going to crash when interest rates went up, but because we're just coming out of a period of very low interest rates, people just decided to hold on to their low interest rate 30-year mortgages and not sell their houses. And so again, what does that do? That creates more demand for housing. It increases housing prices. It creates a housing shortage for our employees who are having a hard time finding even a place to rent. Next slide. So in terms of employee shortages, so low employment rates, the reduced population in California, the great resignation, high inflation that have led to employee shortages in most industries, especially in education. Next slide. So what does it look like at the local level? So while it's not as bad as many districts, Napa Valley Unified is impacted by employee shortages. We closed the year with many open positions, and we've had an especially difficult time filling certain positions. And so this has been especially true in special education. If you look at our total openings at the end of the last fiscal year, we actually had 62 open positions, which I've never seen before. Very, very large number. So going from having to lay people off because we were overstaffed to having employee shortages. So a big switch in the other direction. And so to put it in scale, 4% of all of our positions were open. So very large open rate there. So again, we will need to continue to use creative methods along with substantial pay increases to address this. So Dana Page and I and the whole organization have been working very closely to use data to look at some of the positions that need kind of an off-cycle increase, like IAPCs we've talked about, bus drivers, other positions where we find just an abnormal number of openings. We will continue to need to increase compensation in those areas. The other thing that which I've already mentioned, employee healthcare costs have increased dramatically, especially for Kaiser, which has changed the model that they're using. So whereas in the past, they've just looked at the pool to determine whether they increase rates, but what CalPERS has done is they've taken the entire pool, including people who are in PPO plans, created one pool. So the Kaiser rates actually didn't just go up because the pool in Kaiser went up, it's because the risk pool in general went up. Probably the vast majority, I shouldn't say probably, the vast majority of the increase is due to the overall pool change, not just for Kaiser rates. Next slide. So what this slide shows is compensation across the county. And so I wanted to just bring to the board's attention what it looks like at the teacher level. So while Napa Unified only receives about 1/3 of the funding as some of the basic aid districts, we still have to compete with them across the board. So whether it's the programs we offer or compensation to attract employees. And so when you look at the line, the horizontal line, you can see on the left, step one, that we're below the average compensation across the county. and we're substantially lower than the high end. And so the average across the county is 70,000. Our first year teacher makes 65,000. So we're still 5,000 below that. When you compare that to the maximum, it's almost $20,000 difference just for the first year teacher. When you look at the max step, so we're kind of end career, you can see it's $131,000 on average. Napa maxes out at 115,000, and the maximum is 168,000. So, I mean, I don't know that we'll ever be able to compete to that level. It would be nice to be able to say that we have the funding to do that. Rates of increases for LCFF districts are going up higher than property values in the area. And so what you will see is compensation increases that are closer to the actual cost of living adjustment, which does exceed what's happening in the property market. So you will see, for example, the governor, as a part of the budget that we adopted, that there was a cost of living adjustment of 8.22%. LCFF districts will need to offer compensation that's as close as possible to that, because there's a lot of inflation. It is hard to attract and retain employees. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, school districts do not calculate their reserve percentage as part of tonight's presentation, or part of unaudited actuals, I should say. So this slide is a summary of our budget at budget adoption to remind the board and the community of the impact of declining enrollment. And so this slide shows what our reserves look like with the impact of declining enrollment and the impact of Mayacamas Charter School. And so I do want to remind the community that that first column there that has our reserves at 25%, 25% is about the state average. It is the lowest in the county, so we do have the lowest reserves in the county. And to put 25% in perspective, what does 25% mean? 25% is about 3 months. It's 3 months expenses. So that's the same number that they recommend for individuals. So when people love to come out here, and very recently even said that we have enormous reserves. Well, that's just not true. So it's easy to come out and take out a perspective and say, wow, you have a large number there. You have 26 million set aside for reserve for uncertainty, and you have 39 committed for continued operation and declining enrollment. It doesn't put into perspective what's really happening. What's really happening is we are fairly large districts. So remember that in terms of the size of districts, there are 1,000 school districts in the state. Only 100 of them have an enrollment over 1,000, right? So what does that mean? Most school districts are very, very small. Or to put it otherwise, only 10% of the school districts in the state have an enrollment over 1,000. So we like to think of ourselves as a medium-sized school district, but statistically, we're actually a pretty large school district sitting at about 16,000. So when you look at those numbers, yes, like to somebody who's looking at their individual budget or an individual school, wow, that seems like a large number. But when you adjust it due to the size of our school district, we're sitting at 3 months expensive. So I can't stress that enough, the importance of that. A couple other things to keep, actually go to the next slide, please. Sorry. So what does this slide show? This slide shows the results of what we're at in unaudited actuals. So again, we have an increase in fund balance of about $2.5 million, a reserve committed for declining enrollment, and a reserve put aside for economic uncertainty. And so again, there's been lots of comments about our reserves, but again, overall, this is where we need to be. We are below the average for the county. We're sitting at 3 months salary. But we've also, because of this, we've been able to do a lot of really good things. Like, we're finally in a position where we can add programs and services to reduce class sizes. For example, we reduced EL class sizes from 24-to-1 to 20-to-1 in this current year. We've added additional mainstreaming opportunities for our special education students. Last year, we added elementary prep. We've reduced the number of combination classes. And we very recently added 2 small KA middle school programs in response to community demand. And so we are in a position where we can continue to evaluate programs, and we find that they're successful. We have potential to add programs. And so I am proud of the hard work that we did to get there. But just as a reminder of where we're at just a couple of years ago, when our reserves were 3%, we had to make some very sudden and difficult decisions that negatively impacted the community. It was very hard on our community for that to happen. And nobody wants to go back to closing schools, laying off employees, and reducing programs. Next slide. So what are the benefits of having healthy reserves? Again, reserves give you time. You always want to avoid deficit spending, but if it happens, you have those reserves to address that. And they also give you the ability to remain fiscally solvent and compensate and attract the best employees possible. And just a reminder, reserves are one-time money. Once they're gone, they're gone. Next slide. So again, reserves are one-time money. Once they're spent, they're gone. And declining enrollment will deplete our reserves over time. We're in a position now where, again, we have time to address declining enrollment in a thoughtful manner. We didn't have the time to do that before. I'm very proud that we have that time to do that now. Next slide. So what are our next steps? So our next step is to continue our work with our compensation formula and work with our union leadership. So historically, we've made an announcement and paid our employees over 2 months. And so what we've historically done is, over the last couple of years, we've had an ongoing compensation increase in the month of November, and in the month of October, we've processed any one-time payment that we pay. So we anticipate that we'll be on schedule to do something like that. Some of the other work that we need to do is continue to work closely with human resources to address employee shortage.